European leaders gathered in Copenhagen on October 1st for a high-stakes summit focused on Ukraine, frozen Russian assets, and Europe's broader confrontation with Moscow. The meeting underscored the continent's determination to remain united in the face of continued Russian aggression and to ensure that support for Ukraine remains steady, both militarily and financially. It was a day that brought together the top leadership of Europe, reflecting the gravity of the ongoing war and the shared understanding that Ukraine's fight is central to Europe's security. French President Emmanuel Macron arrived at the venue in Copenhagen and set the tone for the summit with remarks that highlighted the balance Europe must strike between adhering to international law and supporting Ukraine's defence. Speaking to reporters as he entered the summit, Macron underscored that Europe's credibility in this conflict lies not only in the strength of its support for Kyiv, but also in its consistent adherence to the rules that have long underpinned the global order. Macron said, "First of all, I think we need to remain an attractive and reliable place, we Europeans. That means that when assets are frozen, we respect international law." This is what the Belgian Prime Minister also recalled. His statement reflected a core concern of many European leaders that while Russia's aggression demands extraordinary measures, Europe must not undermine the very international legal framework it seeks to defend. Macron then turned to the immediate priority of sustaining Ukraine's war effort, stressing that long-term planning and predictability are essential for Kyiv's defence and for the confidence of its allies. He continued, "The second thing is that we must provide Ukraine with visibility in terms of financing. And so it is a very good thing that we have a financial capacity to offer to support its defence equipment and its macro-financial efforts. Listen, I can tell you that it is obviously the right thing to do." Macron also addressed an issue that has become symbolic of Europe's struggle to enforce sanctions against Moscow, the case of the oil tanker Borak. This vessel, according to investigations, was part of the so-called Phantom Fleet that has been helping Russia circumvent Western sanctions on oil exports. Macron said, "The probe of the oil tanker Borak shows that very serious mistakes were made by this crew, which justifies the judicial procedure today." As you have seen, there is a communication from the justice system. In any case, the intervention teams acted in due time. But this highlights the presence and reality of a phenomenon that we have been describing and denouncing for a long time, which is part of the sanctions we are implementing. He elaborated on the economic scale of this illicit network and the importance of shutting it down. Macron stated, "It is the fight against these so-called phantom fleets that represent tens of billions of euros for Russia's budget, which, according to our collective evaluations, finance 40% of Russia's war effort. And we have between 600 and 1,000 ships operating in this way, enabling Russian hydrocarbons to transit, even when they are banned." So I think it is a good thing that this work has been done and that we were able to interrupt it. This issue, Macron explained, is emblematic of how Europe's battle with Russia extends far beyond the front lines in Ukraine. It is an economic and logistical contest in which Moscow has proved adaptive and one where Europe must remain vigilant. Macron also placed the conflict in a broader strategic context, warning that Russia's actions are not limited to conventional warfare. He remarked, "In any case, we are in a confrontation with Russia, which for several years has been a very aggressive actor in our informational space. We have seen it in the context of elections and elsewhere, multiplying cyber attacks, launching a war of aggression in Ukraine, using nuclear threats, and now, as we clearly see, provoking in aerial spaces. All of this is a hybrid set that falls within the scope of confrontation." His words highlighted the multifaceted nature of the challenge, a conflict that combines military aggression with cyber attacks, disinformation, and economic disruption. Alongside Macron, European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas addressed one of the summit's most significant proposals, the plan to tie reparation loans for Ukraine to the frozen Russian assets held in Europe. Kallas explained the reasoning behind the plan and stressed that the burden of rebuilding Ukraine must not fall on European taxpayers. She said, "No, the reparation loan is based on the frozen assets. So it's based on the Russian assets, actually. And the system is so that, if Russia does not pay the reparations to Ukraine, then, these assets are not given back. If Russia decides after this war is over to repay all the damages that they have caused, then, of course, these assets will be given back and this loan is not there. But if we don't take those assets into account, then it's on our taxpayers, that's for sure. Kallas's comments reflected the growing determination in Europe to ensure that the costs of Russia's invasion are borne by the aggressor rather than by the citizens of countries that have rallied to Ukraine's defence. The proposal to use the immobilized Russian assets as collateral for reparation loans is both a financial innovation and a moral statement. That accountability must be central to any eventual peace settlement. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen reinforced this message, stressing the need to scale up both military and financial support for Ukraine while intensifying pressure on Moscow. She announced new funding as part of the EU's ongoing efforts to sustain Kyiv's defence. Von der Leyen said, "If we all agree that Ukraine is our first line of defence, we have to step up the military support for Ukraine. This is the reason why today we are disbursing €4 billion for Ukraine. €2 billion of that will be invested in drones. And we have to increase the pressure on Russia. And this is why I have proposed reparation loans for Ukraine on the basis of the immobilized Russian assets." Her remarks reflected the increasingly strategic view within Europe that Ukraine's security is inseparable from Europe's own. By framing Kyiv as the first line of defence, von der Leyen made clear that supporting Ukraine is not charity, but a necessary investment in the continent's stability and security. Throughout the day, the summit maintained a focus on three interlinked priorities: ensuring the steady flow of weapons, equipment and financial support to Ukraine, holding Russia accountable for the destruction it has inflicted, and protecting European taxpayers from shouldering the entire financial burden of reconstruction. The discussions reflected not only solidarity with Ukraine, but also a pragmatic recognition that the conflict has profound implications for Europe's own future. The Copenhagen meeting came at a time when the war's dynamics were evolving, with Russia increasing its hybrid tactics, including cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns, even as the fighting continued on the ground. European leaders signalled that they are prepared for a long conflict and that their policies must adapt to counter these diverse threats. Macron's focus on the phantom fleets illustrated the complexity of enforcing sanctions in an interconnected global economy. By spotlighting the ships that continue to move Russian hydrocarbons in defiance of bans, he emphasized that economic measures can be effective only if rigorously implemented. Meanwhile, Kallas's and von der Leyen's insistence on linking reparations to frozen Russian assets demonstrated a commitment to shifting the costs of war onto its perpetrator rather than its victims and their allies. The summit also revealed a shared understanding among Europe's leaders that the conflict is not simply about supporting Ukraine in its hour of need, but about defending the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the rule of law, principles that underpin the entire European security order. Leaders agreed that weakening or wavering in this support would invite further aggression and undermine global norms. As the meeting drew to a close, there was a palpable sense that Europe's commitment to Ukraine had entered a new phase, one defined by long-term strategic planning rather than emergency responses. The decisions announced in Copenhagen signalled that Europe's support will continue not just for the immediate defence of Ukraine, but for the rebuilding of its economy and institutions after the war. This renewed commitment came with the recognition that Europe's own credibility and security are at stake. By emphasising that Ukraine's defence is Europe's first line of defence, leaders made it clear that the outcome of the war will shape the future of the continent as a whole. The Copenhagen summit thus marked a significant moment in Europe's ongoing response to the war. It showcased the determination of European leaders to maintain unity, share burdens fairly, and confront not only the military threat posed by Russia, but also the economic and informational challenges that accompany it. For the people of Ukraine, the summit's decisions offered a measure of reassurance that Europe remains steadfast in its support, even as the war grinds on. For European citizens, it was a signal that their leaders are determined to defend both the continent's security and its principles, while striving to minimise the domestic economic costs of doing so. The speeches of Macron, Kallas and von der Leyen reflected the urgency and gravity of the moment. Their words, from Macron's warning about hybrid confrontation to Kallas's insistence on making Russia pay for the damage it has caused, to von der Leyen's framing of Ukraine as the front line of Europe's own defence, collectively painted a picture of a continent that understands the stakes of the conflict and is willing to act accordingly. The Copenhagen summit underscored that the war in Ukraine is not a distant conflict, but a defining challenge for Europe. The policies set in motion there, tougher sanctions enforcement, reparation loans based on frozen Russian assets and increased military support represent both practical steps and symbolic commitments to ensuring that aggression is neither rewarded nor allowed to reshape the European order.